Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. And joining me once again on the channel is Mark E. Stille, US Navy Commander retired. Mark is the author of numerous books about the Pacific Campaign, including several about the Imperial Japanese Navy. And he's here today to specifically talk about their submarines and, more importantly, how they use their submarines. If you're new to the channel, we had a few new subscribers over the last few days. Welcome aboard. Please consider becoming a patron or a channel member, and all the information you need, including links to Mark's books, are in the description below, where you can open that up and find all the resources. Without further ado, I'll bring Mark in. Good afternoon, sir. How are you today?
Hi, Paul. How you doing? Good to be back.
So we'll bring up the PowerPoint in a minute, but you've written extensively about the Pacific Campaign. When we were talking with James Scott earlier in the week, we were coming up with the idea that it's really the surface actions that have kind of drawn people's attention over the years. And where in the ETO, everyone talks about the U-boats. In terms of the Pacific Campaign, both the Japanese side of things and the American side of things are broadly underwritten about. Would you agree with that?
That's totally true. It's especially true with regard to the Japanese subforce, which, as we'll cover here in some detail as time allows, it was pretty ineffective throughout the entire war. But with the exception, though, of 1942, when they did have a real impact on the battles during that year.
Brilliant. I say that's what we'll get into, and it's basically the theme we're coming along with this discussion is that it's all very well having submarines. It's always it depends on what you actually do with them and what your clear plan is and doctrine and aims with it. But we'll bring up your PowerPoint, folks. Fire away with questions as we go along. Mark, just to me when you want me to nudge on the slides, and we'll look at this this aspect of the war that we've never in fact covered before on the channel. So over to you, Mark.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'm happy to be here to cover the Japanese Navy and their subforce because they don't get a lot of coverage like we just mentioned. So we're going to try to cover the entire force and its entire operations during the war. Obviously, we can't get into a lot of detail given the time, but we're going to cover all the main points for sure. We'll do it in about 45 minutes, maybe an hour. We'll leave time for questions. If you have any questions at all, just feel free to bring them up to Paul, and we can hit them right then and there when it comes to mind. Okay, next slide, please. All right, here's what we're going to cover today. We're not going to dwell too much on the submarines themselves. We're not going to go deep into their technical characteristics, but we are going to talk a lot about their doctrine, because once you understand their doctrine, you understand why they built the kind of subs they did and why they fought them the way they did. And we're going to spend the most time on the operational summaries of Japanese sub-ops throughout the war. Okay, next slide. All right, here's the first meaty slide, looking here at the Japanese submarines that made up their force. It's important to note that the Japanese submarine force is really not that large throughout the war. At the start of the war, they only had 64 subs, and that number seems respectable. But keep in mind that only about 2/3 of those were modern units. And the American submarine fleet was much larger at that point in the war. The Japanese had a lot of ways to refer to their submarines, so that there's a multiplicity of ways you'll see them referred to. So let's try to clear that up right now. This slide is an attempt to do that. Based on the size of their subs, primarily the size, the Japanese place them into three broad categories. The first type are the fleet boats, or what they call the I boats. And these are just the largest, most capable subs in the force. RO boats are second-class boats, but that means really that they're medium-sized boats. And in fact, Japanese second-class subs were about as big as German subs during the war.
Right.
HA subs were all the smaller subs, mainly coastal and midget subs. Okay, and so we're going to talk for the most part about the I subs, the I boats, because they were the ones that were most prominent during operations during most periods of the war. Japanese had a lot of different types of these I boats, and we're going to talk about those briefly here. You see them on the slide. The Kaide submarine was their first attempt to make a type of large fleet boats. They were based on German designs. They got their hands on German U-boats after the First World War. They were given these by the British, and the Japanese found them to be highly advanced as they were, and they used those as the basis for their first type of large fleet boats. The second type are these Jensen or cruiser boats. They were designed for independent operations. So again, they were large. They had a long operational range. And then the Japanese quickly figured out that they really couldn't fit all the features they wanted into a single hull. So that's when they began to develop specialized types of submarines. And we see those here. The A-type subs were command subs, and these are quite large. They had a long range, and they were given extra radio equipment, long-range radios, to perform their command function. The B-type subs were scouting subs. These are the ones that carried float planes, like we'll talk about in a couple of slides. These were also quite large. The main B-type sub is about 2,600 tons, so much larger than the comparable American submarine. C-type subs were attack submarines. They had more torpedo tubes and they could carry more torpedoes. The C-type subs were the smallest of all the ones we just talked about, and they were still much larger than the American fleet boat. So all these are very large subs. Later in the war, the Japanese got tired of using their sexy attack subs for transport missions, as they were forced to do, as we'll talk about. So they did design late in the war some transport subs, and they called them D-type subs. All right, next slide.
Just a quick question before we move on. Glenn Morgan is saying, does the size reflect the range?
It does, more or less. I mean, because the bigger the submarine, the more fuel it can carry. And that was a primary design feature of Japanese subs, like we'll talk about in their doctrine. They wanted long range, so they had to build large subs. Okay, here's the obligatory slide that I had to put in here to talk about the various types of subs. You can see the types listed there, KD 1 through 7, and the parentheses is the number of ships that were built to that design. So here they have all these different types of subs. It's important to note that for most of the war, the Japanese were building concurrently many types of submarines. They were building KD units. They were building the A-type subs. They were building B-type subs. They were building C-type subs, C-type subs, and they're building D-type subs all at the same time during the war, as well as these special types we'll talk about as well. So they never did settle on a design that they could mass produce. The Americans essentially built a couple of classes of fleet boats, and that was it during the entire war. The Japanese did not. They had a bunch of boutique designs that they continued in production for most of the war. Okay, up top of the KD, I'm sorry, we'll stay there for a few minutes. Talk about the KD subs. Again, these are pretty large. They're up to 1,800 tons. They're fast. They're up to 23 knots. So that's just the way the Japanese preferred to have their subs. And we'll find out the reasons behind that in a few slides. But all these subs are, for the most part, large. Some of these B-type subs, like we mentioned, are up to 2,600 tons. The A-type subs are the command subs. They're the largest, and they're even larger than that. So they're all large. They have a high surface speed, and they have a long cruising range. On the bottom of the slide there are some special subs. We've heard about the Japanese aircraft carrying subs, the so-called I-400 class. They called these the STO class, and these were huge subs, almost 6,000 tons all told, and they did carry 3 aircraft each. But then also that last sub there is worthy of mentioning. The Japanese did put some effort into developing high-speed subs with high underwater speeds, like the Germans did. The Germans had the Type 21 that they did field late in the war. The Japanese also had a version of that called the ST. And of note, the Japanese sub was faster than the Type 21. So had they gotten these in service, which they did not in time to see active service, they could have made a difference. All right, next slide.
Just a quick question. So lots of different types of submarine, lots of different classes. Presumably there is some kind of standardization of things like, I don't know, periscopes and communications equipment and doors, things like that. It's more kind of the general kind of frame that would be customized. Am I kind of on the right lines?
Right. They were all built for these specialized purposes. So sure, the fittings are all common throughout the fleet, but the KDs are meant to be cruiser subs, and then the Jensens were built for a different purpose. The A type were different again. So they just for reasons that are hard to understand, they thought it was better and more efficient to build these multiple types than settle on one good type like the Allies did and the Germans did, or a
And
couple of
it's
types.
strange because in terms of aircraft, I'm thinking that the Japanese didn't go really crazy with their types of aircraft. I mean, the Zero in its various forms was around for kind of most of the war. They weren't like the Third Reich where they were having one of this and one of this and doing prototypes of new things all the time. The Japanese, it seems to me, I generally think of as kind of sticking to one kind of type of tank and aircraft, but the submarines they don't follow that rule.
Yeah, they really don't. And the same thing was true to an extent with their surface force. I mean, they didn't build anything except destroyers for the most part, and destroyer escorts and smaller escorts during the war. But even there, they were building concurrent types of different designs. So they just weren't good at mass producing things. Okay, this slide here talks about the RO class, RO type subs. They're the medium type subs. The first one there is an older class that was in service at the start of the war. They quickly took them out of service. But of note, though, this next one, the K5, that's about a 700-ton submarine, a medium-sized submarine. That's the same size as a German type 7, the mainstay German sub. So in the IJN, this is a very small submarine. In the German Navy, it's a mainstay sub. The KS is the production model of the K5, and then the K6 was the last of the medium type Japanese subs. It's a good design for its time. Maneuverable, about 1,100 tons, so it's the same size as the larger German sub, the Type 9. But you can see they did try late in the war to build more submarines to replace losses, but they didn't build that many of these medium subs. All right, next slide, please. Let's look at a couple of cool pictures here of these subs. This is one of the Japanese hero subs of the war, I-168. It's a KD-6 type unit. We'll talk about I-168 later in the show. But this is a typical Japanese sub. You can see from the picture here, it's a pretty large boat. It's got a large sail. It's designed for high surface speeds, as implied here in this picture. You can see it at speed. So in general, these large subs were slow to dive, and once they were underwater, they weren't very maneuverable. And as the Japanese found out, in modern anti-submarine warfare, that's not a good combination. Next slide, please. Here's a drawing of the probably the most successful Japanese submarine design of the war. This is a drawing of the I-19. I-19 is a B1 type unit. If you recall, they built 20 of those, so it's the largest Japanese submarine class of the war. Probably the most successful as well, because these B type subs keep showing up, as we'll see later in the brief. But again, very large boat, like 2,600 tons. You can see in the aft of the sail, it has a large deck gun, 5.5-inch deck gun. It's got that large sail, and in front of the sail is a hangar for the aircraft, and we'll talk about that as well. But all these B1 type units were able to carry and launch an aircraft. Next slide. Briefly looking at the crews aboard these ships, knowing the Japanese Navy, we can all be assured that the crews of the submarines were well trained. They were very proficient in basic submarine functions. The problems began, though, with their commanders, which is going to be a continual theme throughout this talk. So the commanders were trained to opt for maximum concealment instead of being aggressive in the attack. And that's because in a series of pre-war exercises, The Japanese assessed that whenever a submarine was spotted, or even its periscope was spotted, they assessed it to be lost, to enemy ASW forces. So that's really not quite how it turned out, but that's how the Japanese believed it would turn out. So throughout the war, Japanese submarine skippers are very cautious. Also keep in mind that that crew comfort was not a design priority for the Japanese. I mean, life was tough aboard all these 1940s era submarines, but especially so on the Japanese subs. The Americans, for example, tried to make this better on their crews. They introduced AC to some of the fleet boats later in the war. Japanese never did that. So can you imagine being on a Japanese boat for weeks and months in the tropics without any crew comfort? It was a draining experience. A quick note about how they were organized. Japanese formed squadrons, the strength of which varied. Usually a squadron was made up of one particular type of unit of submarine. Squadrons were, for the most part, not always, but for the most part, under the command of the Sixth Fleet. The Sixth Fleet was the combined fleet's submarine fleet. So, but they weren't all under the Sixth Fleet. So there is no overall Japanese submarine authority during the war. Also, it's really hard to understand this, but the Japanese did not assign submariners as commander of the Sixth Fleet or even as submarine squadron commanders. So also they kept changing over the commander of the Sixth Fleet during the war. So there's no way that you can build up command experience in submarine warfare during the war. So there's no Japanese comparable to Japanese commander comparable to, say, Donetsk or to Lockwood in the American Navy. Next slide. Okay, submarine weapons. I just have to talk about this very briefly. The Japanese had a very capable submarine torpedo. It's a Type 95. Not all submarines carried the Type 95 at the start of the war. Some carried older weapons, but for the most part, Type 95 is what was on all the subs going forth into the war. The Type 95 is not the long lance. People hear of any Japanese torpedo, they think it's a long lance, but that's a huge weapon. And it could not be carried aboard a submarine. But the Type 95 is still a very good weapon. You can see its capabilities there on the slide. But the biggest thing it had going for it was reliable. There were no Japanese torpedo crises during the war, like the Americans experienced. It took the Americans until 1943 to get that squared away. And same thing with the Germans. But the Japanese had a very reliable torpedo for the entire war. Deck guns were carried on submarines. Why did they carry deck guns still? Because when you encounter an unescorted merchant ship, you want to dispatch it with a deck gun instead of wasting a torpedo on it. And we got to talk about aircraft because no other Navy embraced submarine-launched aircraft like the Japanese did. In fact, that aircraft there in that first bullet, the Glenn, that's its Allied reporting name, was the most produced and most used submarine-launched aircraft in naval history. Over 100 were built, and they were used not throughout the war because they were too vulnerable for that. But into 1943, they were used off of submarines. The problem was, though, you had to launch to assemble. You had to surface, rather, to assemble and then launch this aircraft. That supposedly it took 6 minutes for a well-drilled crew. Otherwise, up to 15 minutes. But during that time, you're obviously quite vulnerable as your sub's on the surface. This is a very small aircraft, and it was used for scouting only. And we'll see why they put these on subs in a couple of slides. Japanese did have a small number of attack aircraft launched off subs, only a handful, and they were on the I-400 class. These ones that were built never saw combat action. Okay, next.
Before we do that, Rick Green is saying he's curious. I'm sure you're going to cover this. Curious if having a float plane was practicable, or was a concept that didn't work out. I guess you're going to kind of explain that as we go on.
Well, it was a great idea, wasn't it? But to do the things they wanted their subs to do, to be capable of extended reconnaissance, even against American ships in port, you had to have an aircraft. So that's why they did it. They actually used their aircraft for that purpose in 1942. I mean, at one point, one of these Glens actually surveilled Pearl Harbor after the attack. So they tried to use it, but the aircraft was slow. It was vulnerable to operate it off the sub. So this concept proved to be impractical after about mid-1942.
I've just noticed another question that we'll address while this slide is up. Ian Carr is saying, how safe was an oxygen-propelled torpedo? No one else seems to have copied the technology.
Well, it was kerosene fueled and oxygen. It wasn't a pure oxygen torpedo like the Type 93. But there were no problems of handling that weapon aboard Japanese subs. It was a very reliable weapon.
Okay, thanks. Right, we'll move on then.
Where we at? Radar. Yeah, we got need about that briefly because this is one of the prime reasons why the Japanese submarine force did not perform up to expectations. Of course, there was no ship in the Imperial Navy that carried radar at the start of the war, and that included Japanese submarines. There were no submarines with radar at the start of the war. But it took them until 1944, until actually May 1944, to get the first radar aboard a submarine. So imagine trying to operate a submarine against an air threat and against a surface threat without radar. And imagine trying to stalk a target without radar. It was just so much harder. So this is one of those reasons why the Japanese submarine force failed to perform. Next slide. Okay, this slide here, I think might be one of the, probably the most important slide in the whole show, because it talks about submarine doctrine. And this gets to the heart of why the Japanese built the force they did and how they tried to use it. So Japanese naval doctrine, as you're probably aware, before the war began, was linked to this concept of a decisive fleet battle against the Americans. The American fleet was larger. It was expected to advance into the Western Pacific and then the Central Pacific, but it was going to advance into Japanese-controlled areas. And at some point, the two fleets would engage in this decisive battle. The problem with the Japanese was that the American fleet was larger. So a key part of this strategy was the assumption that the Japanese would be able to attrit the larger American force before the big battle took place. And a big part of this attrition strategy was given to the submarine force. So given the long ranges involved here, the long distances in the Central Pacific and the Western Pacific, these submarines had to be large. They had to have a long range. So that's why they were built the way they were. Getting down to the actual missions of the submarine force and this decisive battle strategy, the submarine force was tasked to surveil the U.S. fleet as it moved from Pearl Harbor and headed west. So, and this included not just surveilling the fleet at sea, but like I said, to track the fleet in port as well. So that's why the submarines have aircraft aboard. Then the submarines had to shadow and pursue the American fleet over the course of days or weeks. That's why it had to have a long range. And at some point, the submarines had to be able to attack and attrite the American fleet. So that's at the start of the war. That is the primary mission of the Japanese submarine force. It's to provide direct support to the friendly battle fleet by attriting the American battle fleet. But there were a lot of problems with this. Even though the Japanese worked very hard to develop this very intricate and very choreographed decisive battle concept, they didn't really exercise large parts of it. And that's true with the submarine force. So not until right before the war did they actually put the submarines through their paces and have them do the things they would have to do during this decisive battle. Once they did, they found there were a lot of problems here. a picket line was a Japanese standard way to locate the enemy. It's simply a line of submarines arranged at certain intervals, placed in front of the anticipated path of advance of the enemy. So you would expect them to be able to contact an American fleet coming their direction, but they don't have radar, and there's not a lot of submarines to work with, and therefore the interval between these submarines is often large. So there's no guarantee that your picket line is going to detect the enemy. And if it did, even harder is having to shadow the enemy force as it moves towards you. And during pre-war exercises, this proved to be very difficult. Another problem was trying to get boats into the proper firing condition. And the Japanese preferred that this be in advance of an enemy force so they can get a nice bow shot at a fairly close range against an enemy target. And, it's hard to get your submarine in that right position unless you know exactly where the enemy is headed. And as we just discussed, that's probably not the case, in most situations. So that's why Japanese submarines, the primary reason, why they had high surface speed, so they can get into these favorable firing positions. It's just hard, as they found before the war, and even more so during the war, to exercise effective command and control of submarines as they try to chase down a faster surface target. Then on top of all that, we talked about the caution of Japanese submarine commanders. So you're trying to do all these things to find the enemy, surveil him, and attack him, all while being very cautious. So the whole thing did not hang together in reality, as we'll see. Next slide.
Actually, before we move into the doctrine, there's a few questions about how submarines work. I think we'll deal with them. So Scott Grimwood is saying, how was Japanese sonar and hydrophones?
Yeah, Japanese acoustic equipment was, it wasn't good, but it was pretty much standard for the period. So, and that's an important thing, because part of this cautious set of tactics they used is that they would detect oncoming enemy units using acoustic sensors,
right?
Which were mediocre, but they weren't bad for the period. So, and then at some point they would risk putting their periscope up to take a look, but they would even take shots at enemy forces based off of acoustic bearings. So their sonar was okay, not great, but it was an important aspect of their tactics.
Okay, thank you. And Bruce Day is saying, as I understand things, Japanese submarine radio discipline was atrocious. Any input either way?
I wouldn't call it atrocious, because they were fearful that anytime you use the radio, you would be detected. So right. Unlike the Germans, who were always up on radio, daily, if not many times a day, if need be, the Japanese were not. And in fact, it was hard. That's another reason why it's hard to exercise effective C2 when you don't have two-way comms with your deployed units.
Brilliant. Which connects with what Peter O'Connell is saying, is Japan had plenty of super long-range reconnaissance aircraft. Did they communicate with subs, or did radio silence rules prevent it? And I'm thinking about what Angus Constam said last week on the channel about the British anti-submarine tactics of 1941, when the Germans were using the Condor aircraft in conjunction with the Wolf packs, and it was all a kind of a combined arms approach. So you're saying that isn't how the Japanese do it, basically?
Yeah, the Japanese never even attempted to use long-range recce aircraft in conjunction with, doing coordinated operations with submarines. Now, obviously, when the aircraft reported a contact back to the fleet command, that's how the fleet command, the Sixth Fleet, usually would move these picket lines around. But that was time-late information. It wasn't always correct information. So, yeah, another big problem. They did not coordinate air and submarine ops at all.
And in terms of engagement, Jay is asking, how fast were the various classes? I mean, because you're talking about the size and the power, so surface and submerged. I mean, I know that you could list all the types, but give us a ballpark.
Yeah, well, they were designed for high surface speed, and high surface speed meant between 20 up to 23 knots. So that's pretty good for a submarine. But for submerged speed, that was a lot less. It might be in the ballpark of 8 knots, but it would be, and that would be for a short period of time because you exhaust your battery quite quickly.
Yeah.
So if you were submerged, you were blind and you were slow.
Yeah, and then the last, it's not really, it's a comment really, but Geo Gamba is saying sending out radio waves to detect enemy ships is like using lanterns to find things in the dark. You may be able to locate the object, but before doing so, you will reveal your whereabouts. That's an interesting a way of looking at it.
Yeah, and the Japanese were trying to take that to their advantage. They did deploy these radar detectors that they modeled after German models on the submarines in 1943. So they tried to take advantage of that very point.
Okay, so that's the little flurry of questions done. Back to you.
Okay, the submarine doctrine. Last point we're going to make is it's people you will read and you will hear on various shows that the Japanese didn't have a doctrine to attack enemy SLOCs, sea lines of communication. Well, that's not true. I mean, obviously the primary doctrine, as we just talked about, was supporting the main battle fleet and attacking the enemy battle fleet. But the Japanese weren't dummies. They did recognize the capabilities submarines had against enemy shipping. So yes, they did foresee that attacking enemy shipping would be an important part of the Pacific War. But again, this was secondary to their main fleet. And we have to look at this too. I mean, at certain points of the war, the Japanese gave this a higher priority, that is attacking enemy shipping. And this was effective against ships proceeding independently or in areas that were lightly defended. They never were able to perfect their anti-shipping capabilities with regard to the submarines. They didn't use pack attacks and never even tried that. They didn't have the ability to attack defended targets like a convoy. For the reasons we've already discussed, they're very cautious targets. So, yes, they had in their doctrine to attack shipping, but they really didn't develop that capability to any extent. All right, next slide. Okay, now we're going to go into the war. We're going to cover operations throughout the war in some detail, mainly on the front end, because at the start of the war, the Japanese were at their peak. The entire Imperial Navy was, and that was true for the submarine force as well. So overall, it was a rough war for the Japanese submarine force, but in 1942, they were on top of their game. So, but things started out badly. So people know that the Pearl Harbor attack was a Japanese carrier operation, but it was much more than that. It was the largest Japanese submarine operation of the war. So they only had a handful, 40 or so modern fleet subs, and of these, 28 were directly supporting the Pearl Harbor attack. It's common knowledge that they used midget subs to attack Pearl Harbor. These were carried to the area by these fleet subs. In fact, they were carried by the C-type subs. 5 of them were used in the operation. So let's break out how they did. But the main part of this operation of the subs wasn't the midget submarine operation. It was the 20 subs that were grouped around Oahu to attack American fleet units as they came and went from Pearl Harbor. So the Japanese expected a lot from their submarines in this operation. So we all know that the special attack unit, that is the midget subs, was a total failure. All 5 subs were lost. And they didn't even get a shot off at a high value American unit. So this notion that the Japanese were able to get a shot at Battleship Bro with a midget sub is nonsense, because we've accounted for all the midget subs. Anyhow, they were all lost with no damage to the Americans. So that left the other 20 subs then to make up the difference and have some success against American fleet units at sea. It looked like they would do this. On 10 December, they spotted the carrier. Turned out it was the Enterprise. And the on-scene commander there dispatched several subs to pursue the Enterprise, which they tried for a couple of days unsuccessfully. In the process, they lost one of these. They lost an I-boat. So here's the first opportunity for them to exercise their pre-war doctrine, and it did not turn out successfully. So the whole operation was a big bust. You had all these submarines active near Pearl Harbor in the Hawaiian Islands. There were literally hundreds of American ships coming and going to, from Pearl Harbor during this period. Not a single U.S. Navy ship is even attacked during this time. All the merchant ships out there in the same area, the Japanese only achieved success against 4 of them. So the first submarine operation in the war is a big bust for the Japanese. Next slide. All right, going into 1942, they still had a large number of subs off the Hawaiian Islands. And finally, they did have some success. So the art of Japanese submarine pre-war doctrine was getting as many submarines as possible into the same water space as an American high-value unit and hoping that something good happened. So this was the case on 9 November when a submarine spotted carrier Saratoga and later got a chance to attack her. They hit her with a single torpedo. She was in no danger of sinking, but she was damaged. And that's a big deal because that meant that Saratoga missed Coral Sea and missed Midway. Later in that month, they sank an oiler west of Oahu. That's a big deal because there were a few oilers at the time, and that meant that the Americans had to cancel a raid on Wake Island. The Japanese sent 9 of the subs that were off Hawaii to the West Coast with the expectation of having easy pickings off the West Coast. And they should have had, because the shipping out there was plentiful and it was virtually undefended. So here's another example of cautious Japanese tactics coming into the forefront. These 9 subs, they sink a total of 5 merchant ships during the operation, and they don't even spot or attack a naval unit. So at the same time, if you remember, the Germans were off the East Coast, just laying waste to shipping off the East Coast. The Japanese have scant success off the West Coast, even though, again, like I said, the shipping is undefended. They had a penchant for midget sub operations, even though the one at Pearl Harbor was a disaster. They kept at it, and on late May, they struck 2 places simultaneously. They did sink a British tanker at Diego Suarez. That's a British naval base in Madagascar. Also, they damaged an old British battleship. They attacked Sydney with even less success. I think they sank an accommodation ship. But these 2 attacks, each one took 5 subs. So here, as you're planning your decisive battle against Midway, you've taken 10 of your very best subs, sent them at these secondary targets. You've tied up these 10 subs for the better part of 2 months, and they achieve almost nothing. So I submit that here's another example of bad force allocation of by the Japanese. These 10 subs were certainly better spent as part of the Midway operation. Then in March, they get a new commander for the 6th Fleet, and this guy decides that he's not getting a lot of bang for his buck trying to attack American fleet units. So he changes priority, and now he makes attacking shipping, the top priority for the Japanese subforce. Next slide. All right, but that has to wait, though, until the Japanese conduct this decisive battle. Midway was the first attempt after Pearl Harbor to do so. You would think that Yamamoto would have resourced this battle to the maximum extent possible. And this word does not get through to the submarine force. The 6th Fleet does a very bad job planning and resourcing the Midway battle. There's only 14 subs assigned to it. You can see 11 of those were assigned to these 2 picket lines between Midway and Hawaii. These 11 subs also include many of the oldest subs in the submarine force. The thought being that they man these 2 picket lines, and when the Americans respond from Hawaii and steam towards Midway, that they'll be picked up, hopefully attacked by these picket lines. In actuality, that wasn't the case, as we'll see. A couple of subs also are going to refuel a flying boat so we can reconnoiter Pearl Harbor before the attack on Midway takes place. And there's one boat, which is, in fact, our friend I-168, is assigned to watch Midway. So the operation unfolds as a great failure for the Japanese overall, as we're well aware. And with the exception of I-168, the submarines also performed very poorly. The flying boat operation is canceled because the refueling point is patrolled by the Americans, so we can't do that. The picket lines arrive late, and they're ineffective. The Americans have already steamed through before they even show up. But keep in mind, though, without radar and with a small number of units to cover a large area, it's very questionable, even if they had been there in time and were right on the supposed path of the Americans, if they would have even picked up the American carriers headed towards Midway. But they weren't there in time, so they were a non-factor. But I-168 does perform well during the battle. She's the one that's assigned to watch Midway Atoll. Before the battle, she does a good job at that. She observes extensive American air activity off the island, off the atoll, and the frenetic level of activity even at night. She reports this. The Japanese, don't care because they have already made the assumption that they will gain surprise. So any information that contradicts that is not useful to them. So the information that I-168 provides is ignored. Then when the carrier battle happens, Yorktown is damaged. The next day on 5 June, she's spotted north of Midway, and I-168, being the closest boat, is assigned to go attack the carrier, which is dead in the water. So I-168 does a very good job at this. She gets through an American screen of 5 destroyers. Her commander conducts a very deliberate, a very skillful attack and puts 2 torpedoes into the carrier, and that's enough, and she later sinks. So it's the only Japanese success of the battle, really, and it's the first major success of the Japanese subforce during the war. Next slide. All right, Guadalcanal is also another interesting story with regard to the Japanese subforce because, in essence, it is the decisive operation that the Japanese tried to pull off at Midway. But Guadalcanal is a decisive operation. It goes on for 6 months. There's heavy attrition between the two navies. The first major Japanese counterattack is later in August. The Americans land on 7 August. It takes the Japanese a while to gather a force there, and that creates the battle known to the Americans as the Battle of Eastern Solomons. The Japanese deploy these 14 subs. They do deploy one picket line right in the middle of where the American carrier force is operating for much of the battle. Though the Japanese get some whiffs of the American carriers, and they're never able to attack it. So again, it just shows how hard it is for fairly slow submarines, which for the most part are operating submerged. They're rarely on the surface, but it's hard to have a submarine track down a fast carrier task force.
And at this time, it's fair to say things haven't been going fantastically well for the submarine fleet. Are there any questions being raised higher up in the Imperial Japanese Navy about, are we doing things the right way? Shall we continue this same method and hope it eventually works? We need to completely scrub what we're doing and try something else. What's going on in terms of the assessment of what these operations are achieving or not achieving for the Japanese?
Well, very good question, because there was this debate within submarine force command echelons of what the best strategy is. And that's why in March, the commander of the Sixth Fleet changed over his strategy. But anytime the Imperial fleet conducts a major operation like Midway was and like Guadalcanal is now, as we're discussing, you have no choice. So you may think you want to attack shipping, but you have to, your first call is always going to be fleet support. And that's what happened at Guadalcanal. But at Guadalcanal, things do turn around because the Americans make it as easy as possible for the Japanese to gain some success. the hardest problem for the Japanese subforce is getting a target, is getting submarines in the same water space as a high value target. But that's not as big of a problem at all when the Americans are going to operate in the same area for days and days on end.
Yeah.
And later on, it's going to be several weeks on end. So finally, things changed for the Japanese.
But more because the situation was changing around them rather than them being kind of proactive to affect it. It's because, yeah, as you said, the Americans not decide, but end up, because of the way the Guadalcanal campaign unfolds, they end up operating in the same place, which therefore kind of inadvertently hands an advantage to the Japanese. But yeah, not through their own initiative, though.
Exactly. It's a silver platter. So the first instance of this is, as you see in the slide there, 31 August, one of these B-type subs is able to get another shot on Saratoga. Again, only one torpedo. She's in no danger of sinking. She's out of the action for months, and she misses the next carrier battle at Guadalcanal in October. And then to compound their problems, the Americans continue to operate in the same area south of Guadalcanal. It was so bad after a while that even the Americans call it torpedo junction, because they came under torpedo attack so many times. So they're lingering south of Guadalcanal to provide support to the garrison should the Japanese make a move against it. But they don't vary their operating patterns. So the Japanese figure this out, and they send several submarines into this area. On 6 September, a disaster is averted when one of these B-type subs gets a torpedo salvo off at Hornet at fairly close range at about 780 yards. A nice shot, but the torpedoes miss. But that's not the case, though, on 15 September. And this is when the Japanese submarine force has its biggest success of the entire war. And a single salvo really changes the balance of forces in the entire campaign. So I-19 is the culprit in this case, and she's another one of those B-type units. And she is on patrol when literally the Americans steam right in her direction. So she's fortunate. She's in the right place, but the Americans make it easy. They steam, of course, they don't know the sub's there. They steam right towards the I-19. She gets a good shot. She fires a salvo at Wasp. There are two carrier groups. They're in different groups. One has Wasp as its center. One has Hornet. So 2 or 3 torpedoes, unknown how many, but enough to destroy her. 2 or 3 hit Wasp, and she is sunk. The other 3 torpedoes proceed on to the adjacent Hornet task group, and one hits Battleship North Carolina, knocks her out of the war for several months, so she misses the decisive October and November Japanese offenses. And another torpedo hits an American destroyer, and she sinks as she's headed back to the West Coast for repairs. So a single salvo sinks a carrier, leaving only Hornet operational, and damages the battleship and sinks the destroyer. So that's a good day's work right there. Next slide. But at the same time, though, while they're having these successes against American ships in Torpedo Junction, the Japanese get the idea that they want to use their subforce to cut off American resupply of the island. That's a good mission for a submarine force, trying to attack the Slock from Noumea up to Guadalcanal. So the Japanese appoint a unified commander, and they try to do this, and it's a big bust. These ships are moving in convoy for the most part. During this campaign, only one American supply ship is torpedoed, and she was damaged, not sunk. But this operation totally fails. So when the Japanese submarines are tasked to defend its slocks, they fail. But there are other successes throughout this period. You can see on the slide there. In October, they damage a heavy cruiser. Then a major success in November as the Juno and other ships are leaving the area off Guadalcanal after the first naval battle at Guadalcanal. Juno was sunk by another one of these B-type units. She is hit by a torpedo, I think maybe even 2, I forget. Heavy loss of life, though, and the cruiser goes down. So it's fair to say that this is the heyday of Japanese submarines. They're attacking and sinking or damaging major American fleet units. But by the end of the month, well, by the middle of November, the whole situation has changed for the Japanese. They are unable to supply their garrison with convoys, given the American control of the air. Even moving stuff by destroyers at night becomes precarious as the Americans try to blockade the island. So the Japanese, in order to get anything through their garrison, begins to use submarines. And of course, that's a very, very bad use for submarines, as everybody recognizes. But Yamamoto is duty bound to do what he has to do to get some kind of supply through to the garrison. So this now becomes the primary mission of the Japanese submarine force. And you can see they conduct a number of supply runs from this point on to the end of the campaign when the Japanese evacuated the island in February. All right, next slide.
Just connected with that supply thing, Frank is asking, were IJN subs cut off from the ability to resupply their torpedoes from the cut-off islands? There were stashes of torpedoes on atolls like the ones that blew up on Roy Namur. Is that, their mission is moving towards resupply, but are they having problems if they want to carry on doing what subs do well? Are they still, when you get to sort of 42, still able to bring up the torpedoes?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there are a couple of when they begin resupply missions, they operate out of Rabaul, which is fairly close to Guadalcanal. But otherwise, they're operating out of Truk, which is a major fleet base in the Central Pacific. And yes, they're well supplied from there with torpedoes and other essential must-have stuff.
Thank you.
Okay, 42 review. Then this was the heyday of the Japanese subforce, like we just talked about. So their effect was undeniable, especially against the American capital ships of the day, and that was the 6 aircraft carriers they had operational in 1942. Of those 6, 2 were sunk. Yorktown is sunk by subs. Now it's fair to point out that she was damaged earlier, but then she was sunk by a submarine. She probably would have been salvaged had she not been sunk by I-168. And then the Japanese sink Wasp as well. They hit Saratoga twice during the year, and they knocked her out for most of the year. So 3 of the 6 American carriers in 1942 are knocked out of operation or sunk by Japanese subs. That's a very respectable score right there. But other than that, though, the Japanese don't do as well. They don't have an effect against the Finnish shipping routes, and they do take fairly heavy losses during the year. Why is that? So they did have some success, but there were still a lot of problems with the submarine force. And I guess the main one is their poor mission allocation. We talked about this revolving door of missions. They started out the war with fleet support as their primary mission. That changes to anti-shipping. In the meantime, they have to do these boutique attacks with midget subs against various allied bases throughout the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. And then late in the year, they're responsible for resupply operations. So when you look at that, with their poor tactics, their tactics are still very cautious overall. And the small number of submarines, there's just not enough subs for too many missions. And again, what would have happened had they truly prioritized anti-SLOC missions with the submarine force? That's a fair question to ask because the Allies have prolonged SLOCs throughout the Pacific and Indian Ocean. They're not all well defended. So could the Japanese have had an effect against those? And they did try to explore this option, like we said, after March 1942 when they changed their mission prioritization. And when they tried this in some areas, like in the Indian Ocean, they had good results because out there, shipping was not well protected. But when they tried this against other SLOCs in the Solomons, which were protected, the results were much less significant. So overall, it's a myth to say that had the Japanese concentrated on anti-SLOC missions at the expense of fleet support, they would have made a big difference. They simply lacked the resources and the tactics to threaten Allied SLOCs. Again, they did not have enough submarines to maintain a concerted and sustained operation against Allied slots. Next slide. Okay, 1943 was more of the same. Now there's even more areas that they have to resupply with submarines. The Aleutians was a case in point. They used those. About 15 subs were used in that campaign, and they were used to withdraw the garrison from one of those islands. But there are there's an increasing number of garrisons now cut off in New Guinea and the Solomons that need an occasional supply run by the Japanese supply subs. So at least once during the year, the Japanese made a concerted effort to mount a response with their submarines against an American attack. This took place in the Gilberts in November of 43, when the then combined fleet commander sent 9 subs out to contest the U.S. advance. 6 of the subs were lost, but they did have one major success. They sank an escort carrier with heavy loss of life aboard. But other than that, there were no successes against American fleet units. Again, they sporadically tried to attack Allied slocks. They were able to send 8 subs out to the Indian Ocean, and that met with success. But it's hard to achieve significant results against slocks with a small number of subs like that. So look at the numbers in that last bullet, though. 29 subs were lost throughout the year, and they built more than they lost, but still heavy losses. But the truly remarkable number is that for that, they achieved the sinking of 56 Allied merchants. That's in the entire year. And most of those took place in the Indian Ocean, where defenses were much less than in the Pacific. So that's a horrible loss ratio for the Japanese. It's 29 subs for 56 merchants, 1 for 2. And it's a terrible payback for a year's effort of submarine ops. Next slide. Okay, 1944.
Just a quick comment, Mark. Peter O'Connell making a sarcastic sly comment. Still wondering if the Imperial Japanese Navy Submarine Command had a committee tasked with identifying the least useful ways to deploy submarines humanly imaginable.
Yeah, you wonder if they did.
Yeah, back to you.
This is not just unique with the submarine force. You can see the same thing for a lot of the Japanese other components of the Imperial fleet. Okay, 1944, more of the same, and now they have to support 2 decisive battles during the year. Losses are very heavy during 1944. That last slide, you can see that they lost 58 subs, a lot more than they brought into service during the year. So at this point, the American ASW defenses are very robust. They have introduced a lot of the tactics and weapons from the war in the Atlantic against the U-boats. They use those now against the Japanese in the Pacific. And also keep in mind, they have the advantage of signals intelligence. So being able to read Japanese naval code, they understand where the picket lines are being deployed, and they can respond appropriately. So case in point is the Japanese intend to mount a major effort as the Americans advance into the Central Pacific. They don't know where that's going to be exactly, so they sent out a group of subs in May to ascertain the approach of the American attack. 13 subs were sent out. 6 of these are lost within days. 6 are lost to a single American destroyer escort over the span of 12 days. And the ship has the benefit of good SIGINT and good weapons, and it lays waste to these Japanese submarines who were still using the same picket line deployments and cautious tactics. So at the Battle of Philippine Sea, which is a major Japanese attempt to defeat the USN, the Japanese deploy 20 subs, they lose 10. There's no success from the loss of those 10 ships. And then make things worse, the Sixth Fleet is caught on Saipan. They cannot evacuate the staff, and the staff is wiped out when the Americans capture the island. So now you got to rebuild your command, your submarine command staff. Battle of Leyte Gulf is another example of the waning strength of the Imperial fleet. They are able to send out 14 subs as part of their all-out effort to repel the American invasion of Leyte. And the total payoff to the Japanese for this effort during the period of the battle was when one of these subs gets a shot in against an escort carrier off Samar. This escort carrier is a converted tanker, so it's got good compartmentation, and it's able to shrug off this one torpedo hit. So there's slight damage. That is the only contribution Japanese submarines make during this decisive battle. Now, after the battle, they have some minor successes. They do sink a destroyer escort, and they sink a light cruiser that was part of Halsey's Task Force 38, but that's it. So again, heavy losses in 1944 for little or no payback. Next slide. Okay, getting to the end of the war now. By 1944, the Imperial Navy is in dire straits after Leyte Gulf. They resort to suicide tactics. This is also true with the submarine force. There's only 47 subs remaining in the submarine fleet at this time. Most of these are transport subs. These are the D-type subs that are now entering service, or else they're older units that are converted into training submarines back on the home island. So, but those that are still in service for the most part are converted to Chiton carriers. Chiton is the submarines force, their effort to join the suicide gang. It's a Type 93 torpedo with a compartment in the middle for a human pilot. So it sounds like it might be a very promising weapon if you can guide this very capable torpedo to its target, but it doesn't turn out that way. So during the entire war, only 2 U.S. ships are sunk by Chitons, and the subs that are tasked to carry them to the operational areas are heavily treated. So, for example, off of Okinawa, 11 subs are sent with Chitons to attack the invasion force, and 8 of these are lost with no success. But the last major success of the Imperial Japanese submarine force is against heavy cruiser Indianapolis, which was sunk by 2 torpedoes in July. All right, so that's a quick review of the force at war. Next slide and last slide talks about the force overall. So I think that we've seen that for the most part, with the exception of 1942, the Japanese submarine force is ineffective. It woefully underperformed. But if you take a look, though, at the types of subs they're operating and how they were used, we shouldn't be surprised at that. There were a whole lot of reasons why they underperformed. We've talked about their lack of coherent strategy. They could never settle on their preferred strategy as far as submarine deployment goes. But the biggest reason is, I think, the submarines were they were good units as far as it went. That they did have flaws, obviously, but their primary weakness was there weren't enough of them. So they began the war with 64. 190 were used throughout the entire war. So they did build another 126 more and brought those into service during the war. But losses were also very heavy. So, but they're just, if you're tasked to do multiple missions in 2 oceans, you need to have a large submarine force, and they just didn't have that. And on top of that, as we've already talked about, their doctrine was suspect, the tactics were poor, and the technology didn't keep up. The Japanese didn't adapt to changing technology or changing tactics. Look at the American submarine force. I guess you've already had a talk on that. I mean, they had the same problems at the start of the war as the Japanese sub force did. They had bad tactics. They had cautious commanders, cautious tactics. They had no radar, but they adapted quickly, and they became and they even overcame a significant problem in the form of the torpedo problems they had. But the American sub force became a very effective force in the war, and the Japanese force declined in effectiveness. So that last bullet, I think, says it all. Over the span of almost 4 years, the entire Japanese submarine force was able to sink 14 warships. So yes, they sank 2 carriers and 2 cruisers, but other than that, a handful of other smaller ships. 14 warships and a total of 185 merchants over that span of time. That's an atrocious return on investment.
Yeah.
I mean, the German submarines sank something like 2,500 merchants. But that bottom line there just says it all, the Japanese submarine force.
Well, I was just reading, U.S. submarines destroyed 1,314 enemy warships in the Pacific alone. 5.3 million tons of shipping is the data I just pulled up while you were talking there. And, you know, if we start looking at the British effect on the Japanese as well, that would be another certain number. So, yeah, the overriding message I'm getting for this is it's basically more ineffective than it could have been, given that they start where someone made the point in the comments. They're the only country that's, well, here it is there. Papa Legba saying Japan was the only nation that entered the war with reliable torpedoes, yet their submarine fleet was useless strategically.
That's pretty much true. Yep.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, you can always point to their crowning successes in 1942, but that didn't translate to a strategic success at all.
Yeah. So we'll do a few questions now, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Well, this is a comment really from Trent Talenko saying the Imperial Japanese Navy sub force's logistical role after Guadalcanal limited its combat role, which is what you were saying, Mark. They are an interesting comparison to the 7th Fleet sub force supplying Filipino partisans and still killing merchantmen. So he's making the point that the Americans also use subs for other things, but managed to still keep an offensive arm as well. Is that something you basically agree with?
Sure do. I mean, yeah, the subs that were sent on supply missions were routed to avoid contact with American forces, and they weren't effective in a combat role at that point.
Brilliant. That's great. So Ian Carr is saying, did Japanese submarines learn anything from the Germans operating from Penang, Malaya?
You would think they could have. You would think they should have. But in fact, the two forces there didn't cooperate much at all. They didn't even really coordinate at all. They didn't exchange lessons learned at all. So, in fact, the Japanese kind of dismissed the Germans there at Penang, you know, with their small submarines and they didn't appreciate that they could have valuable lessons to the Japanese. So there was no exchange of those lessons learned at all.
Okay, thank you. And then Andreas is asking, our resident German, we haven't talked about the crews particularly. Was the loss rate of the Japanese submariners as high as the Germans?
I don't know. The German rate was 75%, right? So 3 out of 4 German submariners didn't come back. I don't know what the loss rate was for the Japanese force, but if they lost 129 out of 190 subs, it wasn't a pretty loss rate. It probably wasn't as high as the Germans, but it was pretty close probably.
Okay, thanks. And then Burr is saying, did the Americans ever try to conceal the fact they were reading the Japanese codes?
Yeah, there were prescribed methods to use the ultra intelligence, so they would not reveal the source of like, for example, when they ran over these picket lines and dealt them severe blows. I mean, yes, they did try to disclose the source of their queuing operations against the Japanese subs.
And this is a kind of a what-if question from Doctrine there. How many subs does Mark think they needed? Would it have taken 300 like Donitz wanted at the start of the war with? I mean, 94 wasn't enough. What number would have made them an effective force?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It's easy to criticize them for, gee, they didn't build enough subs, but did they have? Yes, the number would have been something like that. To mount a concerted anti-slot campaign, you don't do it with a handful of subs. You don't do it 10 per year in the IO. You're going to have a huge force that you can maintain the pressure over months and years. Now, could they have built that kind of force? No, of course not. They didn't have the ability to replenish their surface fleet, build escorts to protect their own merchant fleet, build more subs, and build the aircraft they needed. So Yes, they would have needed hundreds of submarines of a smaller type that were more easily built to maintain the pressure on Allied slocks. Could they have done that? I suppose if they made submarine construction their top priority, yes, but that wasn't a practical reality. So
they'd have had to been taking their something away from something else. It's
right.
like the British and Americans in
Yeah.
41, 42. Whatever you put your money and resources into, it means putting less somewhere else.
I mean, once the war began, they reduced their grandiose shipbuilding plans to essentially carriers, destroyers, escorts, and submarines. That was it. And then they didn't build many carriers. So they tried the best they could to build a larger submarine force. It didn't work.
So Matt has done some maths there. So he's saying 129 of 190 is 67% loss rate. So it's ballpark in the same kind of area as the German losses. I mean, which would make sense for a defeated nation. It would make sense. It was similar. I mean, I can't imagine it would top the U-boat losses. But yeah, that's interesting math. So there's an interesting question from Samuel Thompson now. Does Mark believe the Imperial Japanese subscreen would have mattered if it had been on station before Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown sailed from Pearl to Midway? Yamamoto was counting on them.
Yeah, he sure was counting on them as part of his very sloppy planning for Midway. That the submarine force had a major role to play, but the Sixth Fleet staff really bungled that planning from the very start, as far as getting submarines ready on time, picking the right submarines and getting them out there on time. So, so the Americans were already sailed through their area before the Japanese arrived. But like I said during the talk, there weren't that many submarines assigned to these picket lines. There were only 11. They didn't have radar. They're in these huge patrol boxes. So even had they been there ahead of time and were right on station, and the Americans steamed through them, it's questionable whether or not they would have still found the Americans. I mean, during pre-war exercises, that had been a problem. These picket lines weren't effective, and during many times in the war, they weren't effective. So it's by no means a given to say, well, had they been there, the Americans would have been detected on their way to Midway. No, that's not probably true.
Okay, this is another tangent I'd not thought about. Alt 92. One thing you hear is some of the long-range subs were used for transporting goods from Germany to Japan, plans and parts. Any data on Imperial Japanese Navy subs sunk outside the Pacific?
Well, I didn't cover that at all, but absolutely correct. The only method to maintain contact between the Germans and the Japanese were submarines, and I think the first one was late 42, maybe it was early 43, but at some point in the war, the Japanese made a lot of runs to Europe, and some even got back with technology and plans for advanced weapons and that kind of stuff. Again, it was one more drain that we didn't talk about on their main missions, which was to maintain this tenuous link between Japan and Germany.
Yeah, brilliant. And then I think the last question we'll do, Sean Brennan, we've kind of covered it, but we cover it one more time. Sean Brennan is saying, surely the Japanese saw the attrition due to US submarines. Didn't that cause them to review their own tactics? So, I mean, as you explained there, they're getting to the point where even if they want to review their offensive operations with the supply missions and things closing in around them, they now can't implement anything by 44 anyway because they're on the back foot. Does that make sense?
Well, I again, it's so interesting to understand the Japanese thinking here. Why would they think that their shipping would be immune to American submarine attack? They did expect and foresee a certain level of loss to American submarines, but they thought that loss would be low. And of course, they were right for the first couple of years. American submarines weren't as effective as it became later in 43, 44. Again, I can't understand that thinking.
Brilliant. Well, I think there are more questions coming in, but all good things must come to an end. I think we will do a deeper dive if you don't mind at sometime in the future and expanding on this, because as we said at the beginning, you've written extensively on this and you've done the Leyte Gulf for us, but there is still so much more to analyze in terms of understanding. I think it's the crunching of the numbers I think is so fascinating, and just the reassessment of decisions, and like you did with the Leyte Gulf thing. There's obviously more mileage in this subject, I think.
Yeah, I would love to have the time to write a full-length book about it, because it's, given the small number of units, it would be easy to track the entire scope of operations by the Japanese subforce during the war, which really hasn't been done yet.
Yeah, I mean, we're going down a rabbit hole, but James Scott was saying about the various sectors that the Americans set up all around Tokyo and what have you, and they would routinely patrol these rectangles near the shipping areas, near the shipping lanes, and we haven't gone into the exactly what depths, again, no pun intended, the Japanese went and could have done to manage their system better. It seems that we're repeating up what you said earlier, but they have the submarines, they have the torpedoes, they have the speed. They just never quite crack a single way to use them, and we should be grateful they didn't, I suppose.
Yeah, it'd be fascinating to look at the two submarine forces at the start of the war and how they developed. I mean, one went from success to success, and one went, it became irrelevant by 1944, or earlier.
Well, that has been a theme of so many shows on this channel, is that the Axis keep on making the same mistakes and don't learn from them, but the Allies clearly make mistakes. You look at North Africa, look at the use of air power in the Mediterranean. The Allies definitely are not getting it right at the beginning, but then they rapidly, sometimes and sometimes less rapidly, but they nevertheless, the curve always goes up. The Allies do keep on pushing onwards and upwards and get things better and better and better, and so there are bumps on that that rise, but it always steadily climbs. You look at the Third Reich and the Japanese, they just don't seem to ever learn from their mistakes.
No, they don't. They really don't. And I mean, when you have a low resource base to start with, you really do have to maximize your learning potential. And they didn't do that, thankfully.
Yeah, well, we'll leave it there. So, Mark, thanks very much. Have a good weekend yourself. Have a good weekend, everybody, viewers. We've got lots of stuff coming your way next week. We've got a show on U-boats. We've got various other shows coming up. And then the week after that, we've got the myths that we are exploding and busting on the channel, which I'm looking forward to, and then more stuff after that. So, again, links to Mark's books, some of them are in the description below, and you can find others. Osprey have got a whole host of Mark's book. You can find them, and all the other links you need are in the description below. Without further ado, I will say have a good weekend, everybody. Thanks for your fantastic contribution in the sidebar. I will see you all again next week. Cheers. Bye.
Bye, guys.